The year was 1312. England lay beneath a sky the color of cold iron. Morning mist drifted across the rolling hills of Northumbria, where peasants woke not to the sound of church bells, but to the echo of soldiers' boots. The kingdom had long forgotten peace. The king-word Aldred ruled, not with justice or mercy, but with chains and fire. His banners hung from every gate and tower, not as symbols of pride, but as warnings of fear. For years, the people endured his taxes, his cruelty, and his endless wars with neighboring lands. Every harvest season, royal collectors came, demanding grain from fields that barely grew enough to feed the families who tended them. Those who could not pay were whipped or taken away, never to return. The villagers whispered that Aldred had made a pact with the devil, that his thirst for power had no end. And yet, no one dared to challenge him. Among the fog-covered hills, the village of Dunworth stood half buried in smoke from its own hearths. Its people had learned silence. They spoke in low tones, avoided strangers, and prayed that the king's men would pass them by. But on this morning, the clatter of hooves shattered their fragile calm. The royal guard rode in a column of steel and fury. Their leader, Sir Cormac, a man whose armor was as black as his soul, raised his sword and ordered every villager into the square. Old men, women, and children gathered trembling before him. By decree of His Majesty, King Aldred, Cormac bellowed, "Every household shall yield half its stores for the royal campaign." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Half their stores meant starvation. One brave soul, a farmer named Elric, stepped forward. "Sir," he said, voice quivering, "if we give half, we will not survive the winter." Cormac's eyes narrowed. "Then die in loyalty to your king," he said coldly. And before anyone could move, he drew his blade and struck Elric down. His wife screamed. The soldiers laughed. The message was clear. Resistance meant death. By nightfall, Dunworth had been stripped bare. Wagons of grain and livestock rolled toward the capital, while the villagers knelt in the ashes of their own hearths. That night, as the cold crept in, an old priest named Father Rowan whispered words no one had dared speak aloud. "A king who starves his people is no king at all." Those words would become the first spark of rebellion. In the weeks that followed, the cruelty deepened. Across the realm, Aldred's men burned villages that could not meet his demands. The king's castle, Ironhold, rose from a cliff like a wound in the earth, a fortress surrounded by forests, stripped bare for timber and pyres. Inside its walls, the king feasted while thousands went hungry. The court spoke only of conquest of new lands, of gold, of glory. But in the villages, the people began to whisper a new name, the Silent Hand. It began as a rumor, a handful of farmers, blacksmiths, and ex-soldiers meeting in secret barns, swearing to take back their freedom. At first, it was only talk, a dream shared by desperate men. But desperation is a dangerous seed. When planted in pain, it grows into fury. One bitter night, beneath a storm that tore at the sky, a small group gathered in the ruins of an old abbey. Among them was a young man named Gareth Rex's son. His face was thin, his eyes hollow, but his voice burned with quiet rage. "They took everything," he said, standing before the others. "My father, my home, my land. We've prayed to God for mercy, but God has turned his face away. Now we take it back ourselves." Father Rowan placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you rise against a crown, you invite death upon us all," he warned. Gareth looked at him, jaw set. "We are already dying," he said. That night, the rebellion was born. In the months that followed, the Silent Hand grew in the shadows. They stole from royal caravans, ambushed patrols, freed prisoners bound for the mines. Their weapons were crude rusted blades, farming tools, hunting bows, but their hearts were iron. They fought not for gold, but for breath, for bread, for the right to live without chains, News of their defiance spread like wildfire through the countryside. Peasants in far-flung villages took up arms. The king's soldiers began to vanish in the woods. Aldred called them bandits, traitors, vermin, but each execution only made them stronger. For every rebel hanged, 10 more rose in his place. Winter came. The land froze beneath snow and silence. In the great hall of Ironhold, King Aldred sat before his council, rage boiling in his chest. How many villages now refuse tribute? He demanded. His advisors shifted uneasily. 7, Your Majesty, one replied, and more joining them by the week. The king's face turned crimson. Then burn them all, he roared. Let the ashes remind the rest who rules this land. Outside, the wind howled like a beast. By the new year, the rebellion had become more than whispers. Whole towns barred their gates against the crown's men. In Dunworth, where it had begun, Gareth and the Silent Hand had turned the old abbey into a fortress. Smoke rose from the forges where blacksmiths hammered plowshares into blades. Women carried water and tended the wounded, while boys trained with wooden spears in the courtyards. They were not soldiers, but they were ready to fight. One evening, the snow began to fall. Gareth stood atop the abbey wall, looking out at the horizon. The sun was dying behind the hills, bleeding gold into the clouds. "Do you think we can win?" asked Rowan, standing beside him. Gareth was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly, "We don't need to win. We just need to make them remember that we were here." Down in the valley, the king's army was gathering thousands of men in black and crimson armor, torches burning through the mist. Their drums thundered like heartbeats. The first true war of the common folk had begun. When dawn came, the fields were white with frost. The villagers woke to the distant echo of horns. The enemy was coming. Mothers kissed their children, sent them into the woods to hide. Men stood shoulder to shoulder behind wooden barricades. Gareth walked among them, calm and steady. "Whatever happens," he told them, "hold your ground. This is our home." As the first line of royal troops advanced, the earth trembled. Arrows darkened the sky. Men screamed. Fire spread through the trees. The air was thick with smoke and blood. The peasants fought like cornered wolves, fierce, desperate, unyielding. They used traps, rocks, and fire. They struck from the shadows, vanishing before the enemy could strike back. By nightfall, the snow was red. The king's army had taken the village, but not its spirit. Hundreds of his men lay dead in the mud. The survivors fled back toward Ironhold, whispering of a phantom army that fought like ghosts. And in the darkness, Gareth watched the flames consume Dunworth. His face was streaked with soot and tears. "We'll rebuild," he said softly. "We'll keep fighting." King Aldred sat upon his throne, listening to the reports. "The peasants fight like beasts," one general said. "They will not kneel." The king's jaw tightened. "Then break their legs," he hissed. But the cracks had already begun to show. Even among his own men, whispers spread, soldiers questioning why they bled for a king who feasted while their families starved. And somewhere deep in the castle, a servant carried a secret message written on parchment and sealed with wax. It read only 6 words. "The fire has already begun, sire, outside the walls." The wind carried the smoke of rebellion across the land, and beneath the winter moon, in a ruined village, now silent as the grave, the people of England began to rise. The winter of 1313 bled slowly into spring. Across the realm, the land lay, wounded fields burned, villages emptied, rivers thick with ash. The king's banners still flew from the towers, but their colors were faded, their message hollow. What had begun as a whisper had now become a roar that shook the kingdom's bones. From the north to the southern plains, common folk rose with whatever they could find: pitchforks, stones, broken swords. They were farmers, millers, blacksmiths, mothers who lost sons, sons who'd buried fathers. They had no flag, no formal army, only a shared hatred that bound them tighter than any oath. And in their hearts, one name had become legend: Gareth of Dunworth. The man who defied the king. He had survived the burning of his village and led his followers into the forests and hills. There, the rebellion found strength. Hidden in caves and abandoned fortresses, they trained, planned, and waited. The king believed them scattered, but they were multiplying, drawing the oppressed like moths to flame. Each raid on the royal convoys fed their cause. Each victory gave the people hope, and hope, once born, is impossible to kill. The king's council, desperate, gathered one cold night inside Ironhold's torchlit chamber. Maps covered the table, dotted with red markers showing the spread of rebellion. "They move like shadows," said Sir Cormac bitterly. "We crush them in one place, and they rise in another." King Aldred's gaze burned with fury. His once proud face was sunken, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "Then we will burn the shadows," he snarled. "Every town, every field that harbors them, turn it to cinder." "But, Your Majesty," said Lord Hensley, his aging advisor, "if we destroy the land, there will be nothing left to rule." The king's voice dropped to a chilling calm. "Then I shall rule the ashes." Outside, thunder rolled over the cliffs. Within weeks, royal armies marched once more. Villages were set ablaze, rivers poisoned with corpses, and gallows sprouted like trees along the roads. But this time, the people did not run. They fought back. The silent hand struck from every corner, hitting supply lines, burning armories, ambushing troops before melting into the hills. In one such raid, near the border of Winthorpe, Gareth led a small band through the fog of dawn. Their boots sank into the wet earth as they crept toward a convoy carrying gold meant for the royal treasury. "No killing unless we must," he whispered. "Take their food, their coin, their courage, leave their lives." They struck with speed and silence. Arrows hissed from the trees, horses panicked, wagons overturned. Within minutes, it was done. The rebels vanished before the soldiers could regroup, leaving behind a single banner nailed to a Treon open hand drawn in blood. That symbol spread faster than any sword. Soon, it appeared on walls, bridges, even castle gates. The people began to believe that the silent hand was everywhere, untouchable. But the king was not a man to surrender pride. His vengeance came like a storm. He summoned new mercenaries from across the sea, ruthless men from Flanders and the Isles, who fought for coin, not cause. They arrived clad in blackened mail. Their leader, a towering brute named Magnus the Red. His orders were simple: crush the rebellion and bring Gareth's head to the king in the forest of Dunmere. Where the rebellion had taken root, Gareth gathered his followers to prepare for what was coming. The wind carried the scent of rain and smoke as he stood before them, torchlight flickering on his face. "They think we're thieves," he said, voice rising above the murmurs. "They think we're nothing but peasants with pitchforks. But they forget every king is born from the same dust as the rest of us. His crown means nothing when the people refuse to bow." The crowd roared in defiance. Farmers, women, soldiers who had deserted the royal army, they all stood together under the same night sky, united by fury and hope. Among them, Father Rowan stepped forward. His once gentle eyes were hard now, his hands trembling, not from fear, but conviction. "God does not bless tyrants," he said solemnly. "If this land must burn for freedom to be reborn, then let it burn." As dawn broke, a horn sounded from the valley below. The enemy had come. The royal army moved like a black tide, banners snapping in the wind. Arrows rained down upon the trees. The rebels scattered into their positions, drawing swords, knocking arrows, lighting tar-soaked traps. Gareth raised his hand, signaling the attack. The forest exploded with fire. Flaming logs crashed down the slopes. Horses screamed. Soldiers stumbled in confusion. The rebels struck from all sides, their cries echoing through the smoke. It was chaos, raw, brutal, merciless. Gareth fought like a man possessed, cutting through armor and blood, his heart pounding with every swing. Around him, men fell, screaming his name. For hours, the battle raged. The forest burned. Bodies lay strewn across the mud. When the sun set, the rebels still held the ground, but at a terrible cost. Half their men were dead or wounded. The smell of death hung heavy. As night fell, Gareth sat beside a dying fire, staring into the flames. Beside him lay Rowan, wounded but alive. "We cannot win like this," the priest whispered. "They have more men, more steel, more everything." Gareth didn't answer. He could hear the cries of the wounded all around him, the sobs of those who'd lost everything. "Then we take what they have," he said finally. "We turn their strength against them." From that moment, the rebellion changed. No longer just defense, it became strategy. They struck supply lines, infiltrated outposts, spread fear among the king's men. Even the mercenaries began to falter, unwilling to fight an enemy that seemed to appear from the mist itself. In the royal court, panic began to seep through the marble halls. Reports of betrayal, surface lords refusing to send taxes, soldiers deserting. The king grew paranoid, trusting no one. His meals were tasted for poison. His own guards were interrogated at dawn. Late one night, as he stood alone in his chamber, he gazed into the fire and whispered to his reflection in the golden mirror. "They are rats," he muttered. "I will drown them in their own filth." But his voice trembled. Weeks later, Ironhold was shaken by an explosion that tore through its northern wall. A wagon loaded with grain had been smuggled inside, packed with black powder stolen from the royal armory. The blast sent shockwaves through the kingdom. No one claimed responsibility, but the mark of the silent hand was found carved into the remains. The king's fury turned to fear. He unleashed the inquisitors, a secret order of torturers who scoured the land for traitors. Villages vanished overnight, their inhabitants dragged away in chains. Gareth's men moved deeper underground, spreading their message through coded songs and carvings hidden in stone. Still, even amid blood and fire, hope endured. In one captured town, a young girl stood before the gallows and shouted, "The king fears his own people," before the rope tightened around her neck. Her words echoed for miles. By summer, the rebellion controlled nearly half the northern provinces. For the first time in years, the people tasted freedom. They held their own councils, distributed food, rebuilt homes. Children played again in the ruins. But peace was only a shadow. The king would not rest. And in the depths of Ironhold, a secret plan was for a Menja counterstrike that would test the courage and unity of every man and woman who dared to defy the crown. Far away, in the mountains, Gareth felt it in his bones, that calm before the next storm. He stood upon a ridge, watching the distant fires flicker against the horizon. "This isn't over," he murmured. "It's only just begun." The wind whispered through the ashes below, carrying the faint cry of freedom that no tyrant could silence. Summer burned itself out on the fields of England. The rivers ran low and the air was thick with dust, but the fires of rebellion burned hotter than ever. The once proud banners of King Aldred now hung, torn and faded, above the city gates. Symbols of a kingdom cracking under its own weight. Trade had halted, the nobles had grown restless, and rumors of the silent hand spread even within the royal court. Inside Ironhold, the king paced his marble hall like a trapped wolf. His beard was gray now, his crown dented from years of wear. "They think they can outlast me," he muttered to the empty chamber. "They think hunger and fear will make me weak." He slammed his fist against the throne. "I will show them what it means to defy a king." His shadow stretched long across the stone as a messenger entered, bowing low. "Your Majesty, the northern outposts have fallen. The rebels have taken Winthorpe and now march toward Bradenford. The commoners are joining them by the hundreds. The king's face hardened. "Summon Magnus the Red," he commanded. "Tell him the time for half measures is over. Bring every sword we have. If the earth must drown in blood, so be it." That night, under a moon veiled by clouds, the royal army began to gather, an ocean of armor and fire stretching from the castle gates to the horizon. From across the realm, knights and mercenaries answered the call. Drums echoed through the valleys, shaking the sleeping villages. To the people, it felt as though the world itself was preparing for its final war. Far to the north, in the rebel camp, nestled among the ruins of Dunmere Abbey, Gareth watched the horizon glow with torchlight. His face was marked by exhaustion, but his eyes still burned with quiet resolve. Around him, his commanders whispered reports, spies confirming that Aldred was marching north with nearly 15,000 men. "They outnumber us 5-1, said Rowan gravely, the flicker of the campfire painting his face in gold and shadow. "Even the bravest heart cannot stand against such force forever." Gareth said nothing for a long moment. Then he replied softly, "We're not fighting to live forever, Father. We're fighting so that those who come after us might live free." He turned to his men, farmers, blacksmiths, soldiers who'd thrown away their king's colors, and addressed them beneath the stars. "You've lost homes, families, everything you loved. But look around you. Look at what we've built from ashes. They may call us traitors, but history will call us something greater. The people who refuse to kneel. Tomorrow, the king comes. Tomorrow, we remind him that the crown is made of mortal hands, and mortal hands can break." A murmur of determination spread through the camp. They spent the night forging weapons, sharpening blades, and preparing traps in the valleys. Every man and woman knew the dawn might be their last. When morning came, the mist was heavy from the hills. The rebel scouts saw the glint of armor rolling like a wave toward them, banners of black and crimson snapping in the cold wind. The drums grew louder. The Battle of Bradenford had begun. The first clash came at the river crossing, where Gareth's archers unleashed a rain of arrows that blackened the sky. Horses screamed, soldiers fell, and the water ran dark. But the king's forces pressed forward relentlessly, their sheer numbers crushing the rebel line. Magnus the Red led the charge, his sword cutting through men as if they were straw. For hours, the valley was filled with the noise of war, steel on steel, the roar of fire, the cries of the dying. The rebels fought with desperate courage, turning every fallen comrade into a wall of defiance. Smoke filled the air, stinging the eyes and lungs. By midday, the field was chaos. The rebels had been pushed back toward the cliffs overlooking the river. Gareth fought among them, his blade stained, his arms trembling from fatigue. He saw Rowan fall beside him, struck by an arrow. "Go," the priest gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "End this before he ends us all." Gareth knelt, gripping his hand for a moment, then rose. The world around him was fire and thunder, but his voice cut through it like a blade. "Hold the line," he shouted. "Hold it for every name they tried to erase." The rebels rallied one last time, surging forward with a cry that seemed to shake the heavens. They struck at the royal flank, driving the enemy back step by step. Smoke and screams mingled with the roar of the river below. But even courage has its limits. As the sun dipped low, the royal banners rose again. Reinforcements poured into the field. The rebels were surrounded. Gareth looked across the battlefield and saw the king himself, Aldred, armored in black, riding beneath his golden crown. Their eyes met across the chaos. Aldred raised his sword. "You dare defy your king," he bellowed. Gareth's reply was calm, cold, and clear even through the din of battle. "No man who starves his people is a king," he charged. The two armies clashed once more, but now it felt like the entire realm had collapsed into this single moment. Two wills colliding, neither willing to break. Gareth reached Aldred's line, cutting down the guards that stood in his way. His sword met the king's, sparks flying. For a heartbeat, the world was silent. Then, steel rang. The duel raged amid the chaos. Aldred striking with practiced skill, Gareth fighting with pure rage and faith. The king's blows were heavy, but Gareth's were faster, born from years of loss. Around them, men paused, watching the two figures battle amid fire and ruin. At last, Aldred drove his blade deep into Gareth's shoulder, forcing him to his knees. The king's laughter echoed. "You are nothing but dirt," he hissed. "The hand of a peasant cannot strike down a king." Gareth looked up, blood on his lips. "Then it is the dirt that will bury you." With his last strength, he plunged his sword upward, piercing the gap in Aldred's armor. The king gasped, eyes wide, crown slipping from his head as he fell backward into the mud. The battlefield froze. For a moment, there was only wind, soft, endless, carrying the sound of something breaking. The soldiers, royal and rebel alike, stared in disbelief. Their king was dead, but victory did not come with cheers. Gareth fell beside him, the life fading from his eyes. He saw the clouds drift above, gray and endless, and whispered, "It's done." When the fighting finally stopped, night had fallen. The survivors wandered the bloodied field in silence. Father Rowan's body lay still among the fallen. The crown, once shining with power, lay half buried in the mud. Magnus, the Red, wounded and limping, looked upon the corpse of his king. He removed his helmet and whispered, "No man rules forever." Then he turned and walked away, his army scattering into the dark. Word of Aldred's death spread like wildfire. Across England, the fighting slowed, then ceased. The people began to emerge from the ashes, cautious, broken, but free. They buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, and spoke softly of the man who had dared to raise his hand against a tyrant in the ruins of Dunworth. A group of villagers carved a simple stone and placed it atop a hill. It bore no name, only an open hand, carved deep into the rock. Years passed. The forests regrew, the rivers cleared. Children played in the meadows where blood had once run. The story of Gareth of Dunworth became legend, told in whispers by firesides, sung in taverns, passed from father to son. And though kings would rise again, some wiser, some cruel, none would ever forget the year when the people stood against the crown and won. Because in the end, the war was never about thrones or gold. It was about the voice of the voiceless, the strength of the broken, and the simple truth that no ruler, no matter how mighty, can outlive the will of a free people. The wind still passes through those hills, carrying faint echoes of that time, the clash of swords, the cry of freedom, and the promise that even in darkness, the hand that dares to rise can change the world. Years pass since the fall of King Aldred. The war that had once devoured England faded into memory, its scars buried beneath the slow healing of time. The fields that had burned now grew green again. The rivers, once choked with ash and bodies, ran clear and full. Yet, beneath that calm, the memory of rebellion still lived, not as fear, but as something sacred, whispered like a prayer among those who had survived. The kingdom had no king now. The old crown, dented and bloodstained, was never placed upon another head. Instead, the lords gathered in the ruins of Ironhold and argued for months. Some wanted a new ruler. Others demanded council rule. None could agree. The people, weary of titles and thrones, turned their eyes away from the nobles and began to build their own peace in the northern valleys, where the war had burned brightest. Small communities rose from the ashes. Dunworth was among them. The village, once destroyed, was rebuilt stone by stone by the hands of those who had lost everything. The abbey where the rebellion had begun stood again, its bells ringing not for war but for life. Every spring, the villagers gathered upon the hill where Gareth had fallen. There, a single stone stood, the open hand carved deep and worn by wind. No name was written because none was needed. Every child in the land knew the story. The farmer's son who faced a tyrant. The voice that spoke for the voiceless. As the years turned, the rebellion became legend. Poets sang of it in candlelit halls. Travelers carried the tale across seas. But legends have a way of softening truth. The songs spoke of glory and triumph, not the hunger, not the screams, not the weight of what freedom had cost. Only the elders remembered those nights, the smell of smoke, the sound of iron, in the quiet after the storm, in one of those rebuilt villages. An old man sat beneath an oak tree, watching the sun sink behind the hills. His name was Thomas, once a boy who had carried water to the rebels at Dunworth. His beard was white now, his hands rough from a lifetime of labor. Each evening, the children gathered around him, eager for the story they'd heard 100 times. "Tell us about the battle again," they would say, their eyes wide with wonder, and he would smile faintly, shaking his head. "No, not tonight," he'd reply. "Tonight, I'll tell you about what came after." He spoke of the silence that followed the war, when the survivors walked among the ruins and found more ghosts than friends. He spoke of how the land, for the first time in generations, belonged to no king. "We were lost," he said softly, "but free." And that was enough. The children didn't understand the weight of those words, not yet, but they listened, eyes fixed on the horizon where the light was fading, far away. In what had once been Ironhold, nature had reclaimed what men had built. The walls had crumbled, ivy climbing through the cracks. Birds nested where once banners had hung. The great hall, where Aldred had ruled in terror, stood silent. Only fragments of his throne remained, a broken chair of stone. Travelers who came that way said they could feel a strange peace in those ruins, as though the ghosts of the past had finally found rest. But the story of the rebellion didn't die with the land. In the cities to the south, scholars began to write of it, not as myth, but as history. They called it the People's Rising. For the first time, the tale of England was not told through kings and crowns, but through farmers, priests, and mothers who dared to fight back. The ink of those records carried more truth than all the royal decrees ever written. Generations later, a new council of nobles rose to power. They claimed to restore order, to rebuild what had been lost. But the people had changed. No longer would they bow easily. When taxes grew too heavy, or voices were silenced, the memory of Gareth's hand rose in their minds. "Remember the open hand," they would whisper, a warning, "hand, a promise." In the quiet corners of the realm, some still believed Gareth's spirit watched over the land. Shepherds said that on cold nights, they could see a figure on the hills, cloaked in gray, holding a torch against the wind. He never spoke, never moved, just stood watching the valleys below, whether ghost or legend. The idea remained. The people's will could not be chained again. Decades turned into centuries. The old language shifted. Villages grew into towns, and towns into cities. Roads stretched where battlefields once lay. The names of kings changed. New empires rose and fell. But every few generations, someone would find that same carving, the open hand etched into stone, weathered but unbroken. Some thought it a relic, others a reminder. One evening, in a distant age, a young scholar sat at a wooden desk by candlelight, poring over ancient parchment. She was writing a book, not about crowns, but about courage. Her pen moved carefully as she recorded the tale of a forgotten village called Dunworth, and the man who had refused to bow. In her notes, she wrote, "The war between the people and the crown was not merely a struggle for power. It was a reckoning between cruelty and conscience. What the rebels fought for was not to destroy a king, but to awaken a nation." She paused, dipped her pen in ink, and added one final line beneath it. "And though centuries pass, the sound of their defiance still echoes in the soul of England. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder murmured, a distant echo, or perhaps a reminder that every peace is built upon the courage of those who once dared to fight. Back in Dunworth, life went on. The fields bloomed, the bells rang. The people lived not under the shadow of a throne, but under the sky that belonged to them all. Children played among the ruins of the abbey, tracing their fingers along the old carvings. One boy looked up and asked, "Who carved this?" An old woman, smiling faintly, replied, "Someone who believed we were worth fighting for." No. As the sun dipped low, its light touched the stone hand, and for a brief moment it seemed to glow, as if the spirit of the past still lived within it. And perhaps it did, because every time someone stood against cruelty, every time a voice rose against silence, the legacy of Gareth lived again, for that was the true victory of the rebellion, not the death of a tyrant, but the birth of courage in the hearts of ordinary men and women. And so, in the long memory of England, when the wind moves through the hills and the night grows quiet, you can still hear it, faint, steady, eternal, the whisper of the people who once stood as one and changed their world forever. Centuries had passed since the fall of King Aldred. The age of swords and banners was gone, buried beneath smoke and iron. England had changed. The hills that once echoed with war cries now trembled with the hum of machines. The world had traded its crowns of gold for crowns of industry, its knights for men in soot-stained coats. Yet history, like the tide, has a way of returning to the shore. The year was 1798. London was a beast of stone and steam, its heart beating with the rhythm of hammers and wheels. Smoke curled from the chimneys and hung over the city like a storm that never passed. The rich built their mansions above the river where the air was clean. The poor lived below it, in streets so narrow the sun never reached the ground. And once again, the people began to whisper. The whispers were not of kings or thrones this time, but of factories and masters, of men who worked 16 hours a day for bread that barely fed their children, of women who carried coal until their backs broke, of boys who died before they became men, in taverns and alleys. By the dim glow of lanterns, they spoke of freedom, a word older than the smoke, older than the crown itself. Among them was a man named Thomas Gray, a printer from Southwark. His hands were always ink-stained, his clothes torn, but his eyes burned with quiet purpose. Each night, after the presses went silent, he stayed behind to print pamphlets, illegal words that called for justice. He had found his inspiration not in new books, but in an ancient one, a weathered manuscript he discovered in a ruined chapel outside the city. Its pages spoke of a forgotten rebellion, of a farmer's son who had risen against a tyrant, of a symbol, an open hand carved in stone, the legend of Gareth of Dunworth. Thomas read the story until the candles burned out, tracing his fingers over the faded ink as if touching the past itself. "They fought with nothing but courage," he whispered, "and they changed everything." Soon, that symbol, the open hand, began to reappear, not carved in stone this time, but painted on factory walls, etched into doors, drawn in chalk on the cobblestones. The rulers of this new age noticed, and they were afraid. One cold morning, the city awoke to a sound that was not the usual clatter of work, but silence. The factory gates stood closed. Workers filled the streets, thousands of them standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the gray skies. They carried no swords, only signs, their voices rising in chants that shook the smoke-filled air. The government called them traitors. The army was sent to restore order, but the people did not move. Thomas stood among them, his printing press now dismantled, its metal turned into a makeshift banner pole. In his pocket, he carried a single sheet of paper, the same words that had once been carved into a stone centuries before. "The hand that dares to rise can change the world." As soldiers advanced through the crowd, bayonets glinting, Thomas stepped forward. "You can silence a man," he called out, "but not a people." The first shot rang out. Chaos erupted. Smoke and screams filled the air. But even as the crowd scattered, even as the soldiers pushed them back, someone shouted above the roar, "Hold the line." The same words Gareth had once spoken in another age. And for a moment, it was as if time folded in on itself, the echoes of the past answering the cries of the present. By nightfall, the city was under lockdown. Dozens lay dead. Hundreds were arrested. Thomas was among them, dragged through the mud and thrown into a cell deep beneath Newgate prison. Days passed. The air was damp and foul, but he kept thinking of that old story, the hand carved in stone, the fire in the hearts of men who refused to bow. One evening, a guard slipped him a scrap of paper through the bars. On it was drawn a small, open hand. No words, no name, just the mark. Thomas smiled in the dark. "It's begun again," he whispered. Outside the prison walls, London simmered. The uprising had been crushed, but not forgotten. The symbols spread faster than before, carried by sailors, merchants, workers, even scholars. Within months, it appeared in Manchester, in Liverpool, in the mines of Wales. The authorities banned the image, calling it the rebel's mark. But the more they banned it, the stronger it became. In taverns, men raised their mugs and whispered to one another for the hand. Okay? In factories, workers scratched it into iron beams before the machines were built. The legend of Gareth lived again, not through song, but through defiance. Years later, Thomas Gray died in prison. He was buried in an unmarked grave outside the city. But on the night of his burial, someone placed a small stone atop the mound carved. Once again, with an open hand, 50 years passed. The world moved forward, or so it seemed. Steamships crossed the oceans. Telegraphs carried voices across miles, and men believed themselves masters of progress. But oppression, like rust, always returns. The powerful still fed on the weak, and the gap between rich and poor widened until the streets once more began to stir. It was in those restless streets that a young girl named Lenore Hart found the same story Thomas Gray once read. She was a factory worker, 17, her lungs blackened by smoke. Late one night, she stumbled upon a tattered book in a second-hand shop, The Rebellion of Dunworth. She read it every night after her shift, sitting by candlelight in her narrow attic room. And each time she reached the final line, "The hand that dares to rise can change the world." She whispered it like a prayer. Eleanor began to draw the open hand wherever she went, on walls, on crates, even on her work apron. Others saw and joined her. Within weeks, the mark reappeared all over London, the silent signal of unity. When the Great Strike of 1849 began, Eleanor stood at its heart. Tens of thousands filled Trafalgar Square, their voices rising not in anger, but in unyielding determination. She stood on a wooden crate, lifted her hand high, and shouted, "We are the blood of those who stood before us. We are the hand that will not kneel." The crowd roared, a sound that rolled through the streets like thunder. The soldiers came again, as they always did, but this time they hesitated. Some of them had grown up hearing the same story, the same whispers of Gareth and the open hand. One by one, they lowered their rifles. History shifted in that moment, not with blood, but with courage. The government, faced with the power of a united people, bent where it once would have broken bones. The workers won their rights. The city, long suffocated by smoke and silence, began to breathe again. In the years that followed, the open hand became more than a symbol. It was etched into coins, painted on banners, carved into stone once more, not as rebellion, but as remembrance. Generations later, when the modern world emerged with its lights, its noise, its endless hunger for power, the story of Gareth and the open hand lived on. Teachers spoke of it in classrooms. Artists painted it on walls. Activists carried it in marches. No one knew where the first carving had been made. The old hill at Dunworth was lost to time. But each time someone raised a hand against injustice, it was as if that ancient spark flared once more. And so, the legend became not a tale of the past, but a mirror for every age. Kings changed into corporations, crowns into governments, swords into laws. Yet the struggle remained the same. The fight for dignity, for freedom, for the simple right to live without chains at the edge of the new century. As electric lights glowed across London and machines whispered in every corner of the world, a child walked past a crumbling wall. Faded beneath the grime, barely visible, was the outline of a hand. The child paused, tracing it gently with his finger. "What's this?" he asked his mother. She smiled faintly. "A promise," she said, "that when the world forgets who it belongs to, someone will always remind it." And in the hush that followed, the city, vast and restless, seemed to hold its breath, because even after hundreds of years, the same truth endured. The hand that dares to rise can never truly die. The year was 2205. The world no longer wore crowns of gold or swung swords in open fields. It ruled instead through data, through systems unseen, through screens that glowed in every home, and voices that whispered from behind algorithms. In this new age, tyranny had changed its face. It no longer called itself a king. It called itself progress. Cities stretched toward the clouds now, glass and steel replacing stone. Cameras blinked like watchful eyes from every corner, and the hum of machines had grown louder than the sound of the wind. People no longer knelt before thrones, but before corporations, before the invisible empires that decided who spoke, who ate, who lived in light, and who in shadow. In the heart of this new empire stood Atlas Systems, a global tech conglomerate that controlled everything from communications to food distribution. Its founder, Magnus Vail, was hailed as a visionary, the man who had connected the world. But behind the perfect smile and glowing screens lay something darker. He had built not a network, but a cage. Every citizen was registered, every thought analyzed, every emotion measured by unseen code. What had once been freedom of speech was now freedom of surveillance. The people didn't notice, not at first. Convenience had lulled them into quiet, obedience, but silence never lasts forever. In a small apartment overlooking the flickering skyline of London now, a city of drones and digital walls, a young man named Rowan Hale sat before a cracked computer screen. He was a data engineer once employed by Atlas Systems. Now, he was a ghost in their machine, a man erased from the official record. After discovering something he was never meant to see, on his desk lay a small, worn notebook passed down from his grandmother, Eleanor Hart, the girl who once led the workers' strike more than a century ago. Inside, between brittle pages, was the same symbol that had traveled through ages. The open hand. Rowan traced it with his finger, feeling the weight of every name, every life tied to it. He whispered, "The hand that dares to rise," and finished softly, "can change the world." Outside, sirens wailed. Protesters filled the streets, not peasants or workers now, but citizens, students, people tired of living under invisible rule. They carried banners with holographic lights that shimmered in the rain, and on each one glowed the same symbol Rowan held in his notebook. The open hand. Atlas Systems had banned the image, calling it digital terrorism. Every post containing it was deleted within seconds. Accounts vanished. Voices disappeared. Yet every time it was erased, it reappeared somewhere else, projected on the sides of buildings, drawn by children in chalk, printed in graffiti on the walls of subway tunnels. It was no longer just a symbol. It had become an act of defiance. Rowan knew the system better than anyone. He had helped build the Helios protocol, an AI designed to predict rebellion before it began. He had watched as it learned the patterns of dissent, the language of hope, and quietly erased them from existence. But he had also found something hidden deep within its core, an archive sealed by Atlas executives, containing surveillance footage from centuries-old ruins in England. Among the files was a single image, a stone slab unearthed during Pompeii, during construction in what was once Dunworth Hill. Carved into it was an open hand. The system had marked the image as cultural hazard, potential catalyst. Rowan stared at it for hours, realizing the truth. The company feared the symbol, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant: unity, rebellion, memory. And so, he decided to do what his ancestors had done: awaken it again. He began leaking data. First small things: proof of manipulation, financial corruption, political control. Then larger things: classified videos, internal communications. Each file carried the same encrypted tag. At first, no one noticed. Then, millions did. The leaks spread across the world like wildfire. People in different countries began painting the open hand across their cities, from Los Angeles to Lagos, from Berlin to Dhaka. Journalists used it as a signature of truth. Hackers turned it into a signal embedded in every censored page. Even musicians began hiding the symbol in their videos, their lyrics whispering rebellion in digital code. Governments called it anarchy. Corporations called it chaos. But to the people, it felt like breathing for the first time in years. Atlas Systems responded with force. They unleashed drones, black-suited agents, curfews. They tracked every signal that carried the mark. They hunted Rowan. One night, he fled through the rain-slick streets, chased by surveillance drones that cut through the fog with beams of light. His breath came heavy, his heartbeat sinking with the thunder above. He ducked into an abandoned subway station where a dozen figures waited, faces covered, eyes burning with determination. On the cracked tiles behind him glowed a mural of the open hand, drawn in luminous paint. "You're the one they called the printer," said a woman among them. Her voice was calm, steady. "I'm just a man trying to remind the world of its reflection," Rowan said. She smiled faintly. "Then you're not alone." They worked in silence, connecting devices, streaming data through underground networks the corporation couldn't reach. Their plan wasn't violence, it was exposure. They would reveal everything Atlas had hidden, everything they had taken. When the night came, the world went dark. Screens everywhere flickered. For one breathless second, people thought it was another blackout. Then, every device on the planet, every phone, billboard monitor began to display the same image: the open hand, and beneath it, a single sentence: "The hand that dares to rise can change the world." The feed lasted only 37 seconds before Atlas shut it down. But in those 37 seconds, billions saw it. Billions remembered. Riots broke out, not of destruction, but of awakening. People poured into the streets, chanting the old words, raising their hands to the sky, not clenched in fist, but open, unarmed, united. Magnus Vale appeared on global broadcast, his perfect calm finally cracking. "You think symbols can overthrow empires?" He spat into the camera. "You think history will save you?" And somewhere in a hidden shelter, Rowan whispered, "History doesn't save us. It teaches us how to fight." The weeks that followed were chaos. Atlas crumbled from within. Employees leaked data, citizens refused to comply, and the world began to fracture, not into destruction, but into freedom. The system that had watched every heartbeat suddenly went blind. Rowan vanished in the chaos. No one ever found his body, but in the ruins of an old Atlas server farm, a worker cleaning debris found a piece of metal engraved with the mark of an open hand. Beneath it were the words, "If you can see this, then it's your turn." Years passed. The corporation was gone, governments rebuilt, and the world moved on, scarred, but aware. People spoke of the rebellion, not as war, but as the restoration. Streets were renamed. New laws were written, ones that limited power, protected privacy, and honored the forgotten dot in the heart of London. A new monument rose, a towering sculpture of a hand reaching upward, not in anger, but in hope. At its base, in small letters, was engraved the same ancient promise that had outlived kings, revolutions, and empires alike. The hand that dares to rise can change the world. At night, children played beneath its shadow. Old men told stories of Gareth, of Thomas, of Eleanor, of Rowan, names scattered through time, bound by a single idea. And those centuries had changed everything, weapons, tools, even the meaning of freedom. One truth had remained untouched. As long as there were people willing to lift their hands for what is right, no system could ever truly own them. The open hand endured, not as rebellion, but as remembrance, and somewhere deep beneath the modern city, in the same soil where Dunworth Hill once stood, a faint carving still slept in the dark, waiting, as it always had, for the next hand to touch it. The sky over Neil London was not blue anymore. It was a dull, metallic gray, streaked with the neon glow drones that patrolled the air like unblinking eyes. Towering spires of steel and glass rose like jagged teeth from the crumbling foundations of the old city. The River Thames, once a silver ribbon of life, flowed sluggish and black beneath the weight of industry. Centuries had passed since humanity first fought for freedom under the banner of the open hand. Kings had fallen, empires had risen and collapsed. Corporations had replaced thrones, and revolutions had been digitized. Yet oppression always returned, wearing a new mask, wielding new weapons, but carrying the same hunger for control. The ruler of this new age called himself Director Cale Vorton, a man whose face was known to every citizen, broadcast endlessly through immersive screens. His empire, the Global Network Authority, controlled access to information, water distribution, energy grids, and even the biometric identification of every human being. To oppose him was to vanish, not just from streets, but from history itself, in the depths of the lower districts, among the ruins of what had once been warehouses and factories. A young woman named Lyra Hell moved quietly through the shadows. She was a direct descendant of the line that had carried the open hand through centuries. Her grandmother had whispered its story when the world was young. Her father had risked life and limb to protect its memory. And now it was her turn. Lyra's eyes scanned the streets, neon signs flickering like ghosts. She carried nothing but a small backpack and a single artifact, a carved metallic token in the shape of an open hand. Centuries old, but preserved, passed down like a secret flame. It was a relic from the days when humanity had first learned that courage, not steel, could reshape the world. The city was alive with silence. Citizens moved like automatons, eyes down, minds tethered to the screens that dictated their lives. But whispers of rebellion still existed, in hidden alleys, in abandoned subways, in the faint hum of forbidden networks. The open hand had become a symbol again, a digital sigil encoded into streams, a message across encrypted frequencies. The hand that dares to rise can change the world. Lyra reached the underground resistance hub, a cavernous space beneath the ruins. Screens and old machines were stacked in precarious towers, some flickering with light, others silent witnesses to the past. A dozen people turned to greet her, young men and women, some armed with improvised weapons, others carrying devices capable of hacking into the omnipresent surveillance grids. They were the last of the truly free. The director has increased patrols, whispered Cale, a young man monitoring the drone feeds. They're scanning for anything unusual. Anyone caught with a symbol will be immediately terminated. Lyra held up the metallic token. Then we make it impossible for them to see us all. The hand isn't just a symbol anymore. It's a signal, a network. And if we spread it far enough, no empire can delete it. Their plan was audacious, not to storm the city with weapons. Such an attempt would be suicide, but to infiltrate the core of the global network authority. Broadcast a symbol, the legacy, to every device on the planet, every citizen, simultaneously. A digital uprising fueled not by fire, but by truth. The night of action arrived. Lyra and her team navigated through forgotten tunnels beneath Neo-London, avoiding drones that scanned the streets above. Their hearts pounded, but their hands were steady. Every step was a step against centuries of oppression, a continuation of the struggle begun by Gareth, carried by Thomas, Eleanor, and Rowan. They reached the central data hub, a towering structure of steel and glass that pulsed with light. The AI defenses were formidable, designed to anticipate threats before they manifested. Lyra approached the main console, inserting the token into a reader built for the purpose. Ancient encryption fused with the digital systems, awakening something the director had never anticipated. History itself, lines of code, began to ripple through the global network, embedding the symbol, the story, and the message. Screens flickered around the world, in homes, offices, and public squares. For the first time in decades, billions of people saw the open hand, and they remembered. The AI tried to suppress it, isolate it, delete it, but the signal had been seeded too widely. Citizens in every city paused, looked at their devices, and instinctively understood. Someone, somewhere, had dared to fight again. A call to rise. Chaos erupted, but it was not destructive chaos. It was awakening. People turned off screens, left jobs that enslaved them, abandoned the systems that had kept them in invisible chains. Governments tried to contain the movement, but even soldiers hesitated. The legend of the open hand, carried through centuries, now guided them. Director Kilvorden watched helplessly as his empire unraveled. "Impossible," he muttered, as every screen displayed the same single phrase. "The hand that dares to rise can change the world." Lyra led her team into the streets. Neon lights reflected on the wet asphalt. Thousands of hands rising, open, unarmed, unyielding. No one attacked. No one resisted. The city itself seemed to recognize a shift, a centuries-old promise being fulfilled by dawn. Neo-London was transformed. Systems shut down, surveillance silenced. People emerged from apartments, offices, factories, and tunnels. They looked at each other with eyes unclouded for the first time in generations. They saw freedom not as a concept, but as an inheritance, something that had always been theirs. Lyra placed the metallic hand on the steps of the central plaza. Around it, people gathered, the rising sun catching on their faces. "We are not defined by the rulers who claim power," she said. "We are defined by the courage that never dies. Remember, the hand that dares to rise can always change the world." Across the globe, the signal spread. Cities and settlements awoke to the symbol. Across continents, humanity paused, remembered, and raised their hands. The networked empires, the tyrants cloaked in technology, fell one by one, not through violence, but through recognition that oppression cannot survive against collective consciousness. Years later, when historians would record this age, they would not call it war. They would call it the Awakening, a movement that spanned centuries, connecting past, present, and future through a single enduring idea: courage, defiance, and hope embodied in the open hand. Somewhere, deep beneath the ruins of old London, a faint engraving slept in silence, a hand carved into stone, untouched by time, waiting for the next soul brave enough to rise. And the story always would continue. The year was 3057. Earth was no longer as humans had known it. Cities had grown into titanic structures of light and metal. Floating colonies hovered above oceans, and satellites hummed like a living sky. Humanity had evolved, minds connected to networks, bodies enhanced with machines, memories stored digitally. Life was instantaneous, controlled, and ordered. Tyranny no longer came with armies or kings. It came as algorithms, subtle control over thought, behavior, even perception. And yet, the open hand endured in the heart of what was once London. Now, a colossal city of vertical towers and sky bridges. A historian known only as Callan walked among the archives. The archives were a labyrinth of glass, metal, and light, endless halls preserving fragments of human memory. His augmented eyes scanned holographic texts, piecing together stories long buried. The rebellion of Gareth, the strikes led by Eleanor, the digital uprising of Rowan and Lyra. Each era had passed. Empires had risen and fallen, but the symbol had persisted. A single line of rebellion, a hand raised against oppression, had traversed 1,000 years. Callan paused at a chamber marked restricted. Inside, on a pedestal, lay a relic. Not an artifact of power, not a weapon, but a simple, hand-shaped sculpture carved from stone and metal, its edges worn by time. Next to it, an inscription in Old English: "The hand that dares to rise can change the world." He touched it. A pulse of memory, of stories, of defiance flowed into him. He saw the hills of Dunworth, the fires of rebellion, the underground tunnels of Neo-London, the hands raised across continents, centuries apart. He saw courage passed down, a single idea that had survived tyranny after tyranny, and he understood. The story was not just about war or survival. It was about humanity itself, its will to be free, its refusal to be owned, its power to unite even across time and distance. Outside, the city moved, as always. Citizens traveled the skyways, engaged with machines that monitored and guided them. But the relic's pulse was contagious. Those who glimpsed its light felt a strange stirring, a memory not their own, a whisper from the past. Hands rose, unconsciously, reaching toward the sky. Not in rebellion, but in recognition, acknowledgement of a legacy older than any ruler, older than any law. Callan spoke aloud, though no one could hear him. "It is done. The hand has endured. The story is complete, yet it never ends." High above, in the orbiting colonies, a single image flickered across the networks: the open hand. Every human mind connected to the grid saw it simultaneously. Some gasped, some paused, some simply understood. Across continents, over oceans, the symbol became a language itself, of courage, of unity, of memory. Even the automated enforcers, the AI monitors that once controlled thought, faltered in the presence of the relic's legacy. It was impossible to quantify, impossible to erase. For the first time in centuries, no algorithm could dominate the will of humanity. And so, life continued, but differently. Not in chains, not in silence, not under fear. Humanity learned to remember, to honor, to rise. Education systems taught the story of the open hand alongside mathematics and science. Statues were built, books written, songs sung. Every generation reminded of the courage that had carried them here. Callan returned the relic to its pedestal. Its glow dimmed, yet he could feel its heartbeat, as if the stone itself knew that the story had reached a point of rest, but not of death. The past had spoken. The present had heard. The future would act on the streets. Children raised their hands as they walked to schools, mimicking an ancient gesture whose meaning they would come to understand. Families told stories around holoscreens. Communities organized themselves, not under rulers or corporations, but by mutual respect, shared courage, and the knowledge that history could not be erased when its memory lived in hearts. And somewhere, in the quiet folds of the world, beneath mountains, oceans, forests, and cities, countless stones lay hidden, carved with the open hand, some undiscovered, some worn, some forgotten. But they waited, as they always had, for those willing to rise. As night fell on Neo-London, the city's towers glowed softly, reflecting the stars above. The relic pulsed faintly, a heartbeat of time itself. In the silence, Callan whispered to no one, "The hand will always rise, always." And it did, not as rebellion, not as war, not as violence, but as courage, as memory, as humanity itself. The story of Gareth, of Thomas, of Eleanor, of Rowan, of Lyra, it was over, yet endless. A legacy carried through millennia, surviving kings, corporations, wars, and algorithms. The open hand was not a symbol of battle alone, because of the unbroken human spirit. Across the world, across centuries, across futures yet to come, it remained. A single truth endured. No tyranny could ever fully conquer the human heart. No hand that dares to rise is ever truly defeated. The open hand, etched in stone, carved in memory, engraved in spirit, had finally become eternal.